The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales radio show, your fortnightly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, magic, and folklore. And now here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to you in paranormal radio and podcast land. This is our 14th show, our Beware the Ides of March. Let's talk about cunning men, wise women, folk magic, spells, charms and potions show. And now, here's Janie.
Hello everyone. And as you know, yes, it's the Ides of March. How does it go in Shakespeare's play, Julius Caesar? Beware the Ides of March.
Yes, but what exactly are or were the Ides of March? And were they always a bad thing?
Well, it's like this. Shakespeare gave the Ides of March a bad reputation, but to the Romans of that time, it was just another date on the calendar. What we'd now call the 15th of March. Actually, in fact, St. Nicholas, the historical basis for Santa Claus, was born on the Ides of March.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, and because the Romans had a year that began in March, the Ides of March were also a cause for major celebrations, feasts, religious ceremonies, that sort of thing. Because the Ides would have been the first full moon of the new year.
Still not helping me very much, this.
Oh, right, okay. It gets a bit more complicated, actually. You have to listen carefully. Okay. Before we had our modern 365-day-a-year calendar, which was ironically introduced by Julius Caesar, and one of the last things he did before being assassinated, the Romans had a lunar calendar. And rather than count sequentially from the first of the month through to the last day, they would count backwards from one of three fixed points that were determined by the phase of the moon. The first phase of the moon, the new moon, which was classed as the first day of the month, was called the calends, which is where we get the word calendar from. The second phase, the first quarter moon, was called the nones and fell on either the 5th or the 7th day of the month. And the third phase, the Ides, was the full moon and fell on either the 13th or the 15th day of the month. So the Ides of March was the 15th of March, but the Ides of April was on the 13th.
Right.
Now, you think that's confusing, but you know I mentioned the Romans didn't count dates sequentially, but counted back from these three fixed points. So if you were planning a 4th of July party back in Roman times, you would have sent out an invitation saying, "We're holding a party 4 days before the nones of July." So, you know, people didn't turn up. Hardly surprising.
And people ask us, what did the Romans ever do for us?
Got us very muddled up. That's
Exactly.
What they did.
We're now heading off into the world of folk magic, charms, spells and witchcraft, and are going to talk to Andrew Mercer about his new book, The Wicked Shall Decay, which is available now on Amazon and in all good occult bookshops from the Three Hands Press. Andrew, or A.D. Mercer to give the name on the front cover, is a writer, researcher and professional psychotherapist with over 30 years' experience investigating both the esoteric and the paranormal. Outside his publications in the field of psychotherapy, his occult works have focused on the runes and Enochian magical arcana. He also hosts a monthly internet radio show called Radio Hermetica, dedicated to all aspects of the esoteric and the occult. Andy, your new book, The Wicked Shall Decay, Charms, Spells and Witchcraft of Old Britain. Tell us something about it. I mean, what was the inspiration for writing it, and then what types of topics are you covering in it?
Well, it all really goes back to a book launch I went to myself about 3 years ago now. It was a launch of a book called The Devil's Plantation by a guy called Nigel Pearson, who I've got to know quite well actually now. I knew who he was before, but he owns a little shop in Ipswich, and the book launch was up there. And one of the things that was talked about at the launch is these things which in Scandinavian magical traditions are known as the Svartsenbok, the Book of Magic, or Black Books of Magic as they're called. Now, there's quite a few of those that are known to exist, and indeed they've been recently published by Three Hands Press, who published my book, published one, and there's been other books that have been published fairly recently. But as one of the speakers pointed out, we know of titles of a few British versions of these books of magic, handwritten notes that have been kept, but they've all been lost to the mists of time, as it were. They've just kind of disappeared. No one knows what's happened to them. We've got a few titles of these sort of books, one of which was The Devil's Plantation, which my friend's book used that as the title. It's about his own working with traditional witchcraft rather than sort of historic stuff, as if you like. But The Devil's Plantation is the title of one such book, and there's things called the Red Book of Appin and the Secret Granary. There's all kinds of handwritten collections of spells of English and British magic, but they've all been lost. They've kind of disappeared. And running concurrent to this, I've always been interested, like yourself, in folklore and sort of folk magic, and I have got quite a large collection of books, mainly from the Folklore Society, published mainly in sort of Victorian Edwardian times, sort of 1800s into the very early 1900s. And all these books contain stories of folklore and myths and all sorts of adventures and these kinds of things. But scattered amongst them are actual written down spells and charms of witchcraft and magic, which the writers have recorded. And I actually thought, well, although the Black Books no longer exist, other than in title form, you could easily go through this and put together a book of spells based on real, genuine examples of historic sort of magic from earlier times. I say most of the books I use are from the Victorian or Edwardian age, but obviously they're recording stuff that goes even further back. So I just basically got sort of beavering through the books I've got. Now, most of the spells you find are kind of banal. They're kind of things like better crops and, things like that, trying to sort of the farm work better. Or one of the most common ones you find is find about who your true love is going to be, or if your marriage is going to succeed, and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Lots of spells like that, which are interesting in themselves, but pretty sort of dull and benign. But amongst them, I found spells for things like battling against witchcraft and black magic and that sort of thing, how to protect oneself from evil and darkness, that sort of thing. And they were much more interesting and much more kind of the thing I was looking for. So basically what I did was just sat down with those books over a number of months and started to gradually compile the more interesting ones I found and put them all together into the book that became The Wicked Shall Decay. It's my third book. My first two were with another publisher. Now the titles he publishes tend to be more in what you might call Luciferian kind of, not black magic, not dark stuff, but more kind of close associated with what you would call ceremonial magic, high magic, that kind of stuff. This wasn't really his kind of thing. So although I talked to my previous publisher about the idea of it, he was interested, but he didn't really know a lot about the kind of area. And I thought, well, I'd rather go with someone who publishes stuff that's more in that kind of field. And bit of a long story. I knew the owner of Three Hands Press just because of an acquaintance from many, many years ago. The guy who runs it now, Daniel Schalk, used to be friends with a chap called Andrew Chumley, who unfortunately passed away in the early 2000s. Now, Andrew was quite an important occult writer. He'd was running his own quite secretive group. He had a couple of books which he'd published himself that had become absolute classics in the modern kind of magical circles. The Azoisha being by far the most famous, and Kitab. Now, his stuff is really fascinating, interesting stuff. And as I say, unfortunately, I met him many years ago, a couple of times, at a thing called EarthQuest group, which used to be run by a guy called Andy Collins in Essex back in the 1980s. And Andrew Chumley was a member. I met him a couple of times then. We briefly spoke about one or two things. And I kind of got to know Daniel because I was pretty much the only person he knew from that time period that knew Andrew Chumley from those days. So we'd kind of got talking on the internet before about various things. Because Daniel's based over in California, but he'd been over to the UK a few times, obviously met with Andrew Chumley, and he knew Essex fairly well. And we were just talking about the area and the fact that bands like Depeche Mode are from here, and I used to like them, he used to like them. So we kind of got chatting as well. And I just sort of thought I'll put his idea of this book to him and see what he thought, if it would be the kind of thing that Three Hands would be interested in, kind of thinking they might be. And he was very much interested. So that really started from there to the notes I'd put together kind of for a small kind of low circulation publication to be quite a bit of a bigger publishing house, and in Three Hands Press, and they very much liked the idea, and it is now coming out. So.
That's brilliant. When you're saying about older ones, the type of spells and charms, etc., these are more, if you like, sort of thing that cunning men would be using rather than sort of ritual magic.
Absolutely, yeah. That would be the kind of definition, the dividing factor, if you like. If you think of this as real witchcraft, if you like, rather than, I mean, just briefly, as you know, we've got three kinds. Basically, you've got the modern Wiccan stuff, which is an invention of the 1940s by Gerald Gardner. Yes. Then you have a kind of reaction to that, which is called traditional witchcraft. Traditional witchcraft is still trying to hark back to traditional witchcraft, but it's still a kind of modern invention. They're taking lots of material, like the kind of stuff I've used, to construct a modern magical systems. It's still what you might call low magic, the kind of magic of the ordinary person rather than high ritual magic, but it's still a construct. It's still something that's been put together. Now, what I was looking for was the actual original examples that may have been used by, as you say, cunning men and wise women in the past, in the sort of the villages. And a lot of the references in the books I was using would mention people like the Wise Man of Bombay as an example, or Nursey Wells, names that you kind of can imagine these sort of people would have used. So it is very much the sort of things that the cunning men and the wise women would have used, would have been involved in. But some of it was actually clearly the farmers themselves, what they've kind of picked up from relatives or people in the village nearby that they were using themselves directly. So it's almost as if some of this is like farming rural knowledge that was sort of there but not really recorded until the Victorian folklorists started to come along and collect this kind of information.
Yeah, and obviously your part of the world, Essex, was one of the sort of last strongholds of cunning men, wasn't it? I mean,
absolutely.
The sort of right through till the early 20th century, weren't they? There were still some, I think, floating around.
It's interesting. I kind of mentioned that. Yes, very much so. One of the things that has often intrigued me, and this is going a bit of a tangent, but I think it's worth mentioning because I do talk about this a bit in my book, is the whole notion of who is the most famous Essex-based cunning man. Now, we know that kind of more generally people think of a chap called George Pickingill, who supposedly lived in Cunning up until the end of the early 1900s, should say, and has become in modern eyes and ears this great cunning man of magic with his covens and these witches in white and some in silk, some in cotton. And it's absolute raving nonsense. It really doesn't add up at all. Myself and a friend of mine have done a lot of digging around this, and it gets a bit controversial sometimes. People are unprepared to accept that there may be some mistakes here. But one of the guys that really is genuinely a cunning man that has historically recorded at the time is a guy called James Cunning Murrell. Now, he lived in Hadley, just down the road from me, from the early to mid-1800s, and many of the exploits and adventures that Pickingill was supposed to have been involved in later on are identical to what actual James Cunning Murrell was doing 50 to 100 years before Pickingill became known. If you go back to Pickingill's life, he passed away, I think, about 1908, I think it is. And in his lifetime, and very soon afterwards, there is nothing about him and magic at all. He has been recorded as being supposedly the country's oldest man, which again is not particularly true. He was over 6 foot tall, so he was very unusual for his height. But if you look at any writings around the time of Pickingill, there is no reference whatsoever to anything to do with magic. It isn't until really the 1960s when Eric Maple, an amateur historian, started writing about the folklore and mythology of Essex that you start to see this kind of thing being talked about, this Pickingill link. Now, from my own research, what I know is basically Eric Maple spoke to one person in the village of Canewdon, where Pickingill may well have lived, who started telling these tales about what George Pickingill was supposed to have been up to. But in my own research, when I was looking for more information on cunning men and witchcraft and magic, I came across a book that was originally published in the 1920s. And the author of the book had actually spoken to people who knew Murrell directly, almost like second generations below, a woman called C.C. Mason. Now, what she had written about, in quite a lot of detail, is the exploits of James Murrell. And when you read that and compare it to what Eric Maple was saying about George Pickingill, you realise there's no doubt about it. It's the same person. The stuff that Pickingill is supposed to have been done has been attributed to Pickingill, but it's definitely Murrell's activity. Now, we know Murrell had relatives living in Canewdon. He visited the place regularly. And as I say, there's even reports from the 1850s, 1860s in local newspapers talking about James Cunning Murrell being up to all sorts of things, being a local quack doctor and herbalist in Hadley. This is the 1957 Chelmsford Chronicle. So there's writings about Murrell at the time. Not a word about Pickingill until decades later. And you have a chap called, I forget his first name now, Liddell, surname is Liddell. He wrote a book with Michael Howard called The Pickingill Papers, where Liddell outlines a really ridiculously over-the-top story about how Pickingill influenced Gardner forming the Wicca movement, how he influenced and helped wrote spells and rituals for Aleister Crowley. I mean, it's just nonsense. It really is. And most people do, except that the Liddell's book is a little bit over the top and a bit out there. But because some people have really attached their name, if you like, to Pickingill as being this genuine cunning man, there's still this kind of myth continues, but it just, as soon as you start to examine it, it really does fall apart. But because people have invested time and effort into believing George Pickingill has been this famous witch and cunning man, the story persists, and it's a little annoying, to say the least, because, as I say, James Murrell is getting overlooked, and he's the guy who was genuinely doing this stuff. We have, his own book of magic was known of until fairly recently to still exist and still be available. Unfortunately, it's now been lost, but it was talked about as recently as the 1950s. And there is even a picture, which you can find online, it's actually in my book, of an example of Murrell's own book of magic, a single page. And the interesting thing I discovered was, well, I discovered it, others had noticed it, that it's actually based on a book by a chap called Francis Barrett called The Magus, which was published in 1801. And interestingly, we know that Murrell lived for a time in London and worked in an apothecary, a chemist's. And we also know that Barrett was linked to a chemist. So there's a possibility that they actually met. Or certainly that's probably where Murrell got hold of his copy of the book, and it was clearly a book he used. We also know that Murrell had a copy of Culpeper's Herbal, which is quite a famous book for magic, because it also talks about the star signs and times of the day for the correct work. And
I mean, that's 17th century, isn't it? I think that one goes back
to. Yeah. And apparently Murrell's copy had all sorts of annotations and notes and corrections in there of how he'd worked with the system and made his own changes to it. So Murrell was clearly an educated man. He clearly could read well and was well versed in magic. And he really stands out as being the genuine cunning man of the area, and has been somewhat overshadowed and overlooked because of this nonsense about Pickingill. I mean, when you really dig into it, as I say, Eric Maple spoke to one quite elderly lady who could easily have made the mistake and mixed the people up. Another person is Professor Ronald Hutton, who's very much pushing forward the theory of Pickingill. And he says he interviewed an elderly lady in Canewdon, I think it was 1980s, must have been 70s or 80s, who told similar stories. But what Professor Hutton left out was he would have been 13 years old when he interviewed this woman. Now, is it possible that this elderly lady may have made a few stories up, tall tales to tell a young lad who's interested in magic? It makes you wonder, doesn't it? There's a possibility.
Yes.
That perhaps his leg was being pulled. Now, interestingly enough, my friend Richard Ward wrote an article, a two-part article for a magazine called The Cauldron, which is actually printed by, or was printed by Michael Howard, say, before she passed away. And he outlined in great detail what we're talking about right now, a lot more detail than I've got into, about how it was fairly clear that Cunning Merrill was the original, real, genuine Cunning man. And Rod Hutton actually wrote back a response to the article. And I think even Professor Hutton now kind of accepts that maybe he may have got things a bit wrong. And he accepts as a possibility that perhaps Merrill is the genuine article, and perhaps Picking-Gill has been kind of hijacked along the way. So even he's backed off a little bit, even though, as I say, he's very much a professor of sort of medieval history, I think it is, and that sort of thing. But that kind of field, certainly.
Yes, yeah. No, I've read his stuff, and it is one of his books on the triumph of magic, or the development of it, and he pulls together all the various strands, including the sort of low magic and the ritual magic, and the Gerald Gardner bit, and of course Alistair Crowley. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to your book now, going back to the spells and charms, have you tried any of them to see whether or not they work? I mean, obviously, I suspect you don't have any cows in the back garden that you want to make sure that their milk is good, but...
No, very much so. Very much so, living in the middle of a rather large town. You don't really get a chance to try those sort of things out. I've kind of dabbled a few bits and pieces with some of them. I've never tried anything directly myself. I mean, many of the charms themselves are specifically for things that wouldn't be a problem for me, if you like, not to have to do witches on a very regular basis, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And
many of them are kind of just read out aloud. A lot of them don't require a lot of work for them to actually be done. There's a few that involve bits and pieces of sort of plants, and sometimes bits of animals are involved, but a lot of them are literally you just say the words aloud, and you don't have to do an awful lot more than that. So I've experimented with all sorts of forms of magic over the last 30 years, I suppose. I've been involved in this kind of stuff. So I kind of yes and no, if you like.
You are listening to the Weird Tales Radio Show with Charles Christian on Internet Radio and podcast.
Does the book include some of these strange horseman's type rituals, using frog bones and all that kind of stuff?
You hit on two particular areas that I put a lot of focus upon: the horseman's word and the toad bone ritual, the ritual of the toad, or the waters of the source they're known. Yeah. Both of them have come to the fore over the recent years. Going back to talking about previously Mr. Andrew Chumley, one of the books he wrote is called The Grimoire of the Golden Toad, where he outlines the toad bone ritual, which is said to give you all sorts of dark magical powers that involves, as I say, the use of a toad and a particular bone, which you then have to extract by the use of ants, which are supposed to eat away the flesh of the dead toad, and then you're supposed to throw them into the river, and the one that flows in the wrong direction is the toad bone magic, is the bone you need for them. Again, never tried it myself, I have to admit. I know someone who has, and they've had some very interesting results from it. Obviously, Mr. Chumley himself, I suppose he tried it out, but this was long after I knew him, so I never had a chance to find out how he got on with it. But it is supposed to have some strange effects upon people. So that one I've focused on because, as I say, it's become one of those ones that's caught the imagination. But also the Horseman's Word. That one is another one that I knew of because there's a very good book put together by Ben Fernie on the Horseman's Word a few years back, which I've got a copy of here, where he collected together written examples of information about the Horseman's Word. Again, it supposedly gives you power over animals, particularly horses, of course, but other animals as well, to do the bidding. And you do wonder, one thing I did talk briefly about in my book, is it possibly that Murrell may have known that ritual or been involved in the Horseman's Word, because there are tales of him having strange effects upon animals. Now, again, this has been attributed more to Picking-Gill, but again, there's no real evidence. It goes back to Murrell instead, that he may well have been involved. The interesting thing I do talk briefly about is the fact that it seems to occur in two places in particular, the Horseman's Word ritual, up in Scotland on the west coast and down here in Essex. Now, I remember some of our research suggested that some of the workers who were involved in sort of horse work in Scotland did come down south at some point in the 1800s, primarily looking for work, but coming into the rural areas of the southeast, and they may well have brought the ritual with them. But again, there are some examples recorded in the folklore books of the ritual being carried out, and some of them what it involved. But it all sounds like a kind of low Freemasonry, I suppose, is the way of looking at it. So definitely a kind of secret society that probably shared some information about good horse breeding and what to look out for, but with this kind of edge of almost diabolical, sinister activity. And they have to, in one of the rituals of initiation, you have to shake the hand of what they call the old child, which apparently is a reference to the devil. And often it's a branch or twig that they've made shaped into like a hand with obviously a few prongs to make out fingers, and the aspirant is blindfolded, so they have no idea what they're handling or holding on to. Then that apparently it's caused a bit of mirth a few times, but it spooked the hell out of the person who was actually being introduced into the horseman's word ritual. Again, there are reports of almost like satanic horses emerging, these sort of fiery brimstone creatures that have been summoned up by these people to take revenge. Now, I didn't mention those because there were more stories rather than actually examples, so I tended to move away from those. But again, there are examples of those in the folklore books I've got where these sinister creatures are said to have appeared from nowhere, and there are other tales of being able to guide animals to places or away from places with just a look, not even having to say anything, just literally looking at the horse, and the horse seems to respond, even though they've never met the horse previously. So again, fascinating stuff. How real it is, how effective it is, I honestly don't know, but it certainly seems those that made use of these rituals certainly believe they work. And I think with magic itself, if there's a deep conviction it's going to work, I think that goes some way towards making it actually work, if you like.
Yeah. And of course, the thing we tend to forget now in the 21st century is that horses weren't just a rural phenomenon. I mean, the whole economy in the 19th century was based on horses for transport, and the cities were packed with horses, and everything depended on them. So people who had the skill to get a recalcitrant horse doing something or whatever, they would be highly valued.
Absolutely. As you say, they're the essential lifeblood of not just the rural communities, transport, all those sorts of things. So if you appear to have power to help or heal horses, that was definitely something that was in high demand. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, even today, because we used to keep horses here, even today there's people who call themselves horse whisperers that apparently... It's essentially they can read what the horse is going to do and work with them to achieve what they want to do rather than try and just use brute force against them. But again, it's to anybody who doesn't understand the horses or what they're doing, it does seem like they've got magical skills and they can make a horse that's bucking and throwing people off suddenly become calm and placid.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and that's just to say it's a skill today, but in the times you're talking about here, that would be absolutely essential. It would make you very much a valuable commodity to the village if someone had that kind of ability to even just calm these animals and get them to do the work they're supposed to be doing, because that can be a matter of life or death for some people, of course.
Yeah,
in farming communities.
Any other things you want to tell me about the book?
I don't know, really. Let's have a look. I mean, one of the spells, charms that I came across again and again, which I've also talked about, is the famous abracadabra. Mm-hmm. With the versions I came across, mainly was the word would be completed to start at the top.
Yeah.
And then you eliminate letters, either the first letter or the last letter, or both letters, depending how quickly you want to eliminate it down. But they were often used as a way of breaking other spells, that as the word came down to a single character, so the effect that you were trying to break would be broken because it was being limited down. Also, you can build it up from a single character to enable something to happen as well. It's like almost like a cover-all word, if you like, abracadabra. It's the one that kind of has all the magical effects that you could possibly imagine. A bit like, with your conjurer with his top hat and his wand, and he waves it, says abracadabra and pulls a rabbit out. It's almost like the utility word, if you like, of making things happen. So it tended to be either one way or the other, to enable something or to end something, to bring it down, to stop it having its effect. Yeah.
Where does the word abracadabra come from? I mean, I've seen various suggestions. It might be of Arabic origin or what?
What I found, again, digging around for other things I'm working on, it goes back predominantly to either Greek or Aramaic. Probably Aramaic, as in the language of the Bible for biblical times, and may well have made its way into Greece from there, along with obviously the kind of the New Testament text, that kind of thing. It tends to go back. That takes it back to a good couple of thousand years ago, so that does take it back. But obviously it's a variation. This whole word has slightly different spelling, different forms, but the idea of that long word and then eliminate it down to the single character has been the common thread of the abracadabra or abrahadabra. There's another version as well. There's a Greek version that I came across. There's also a Latin version, which is a different word, but said to have the same meaning. And I was just going to find it, because I do mention a single example I actually found in the country stuff I was here. It was actually based around a Latin version, which starts off with SDPNQCN and then eliminates the first letter down. Yeah. Or there was another version, which was SICYCVMA, again eliminating the first letter down to a single A. These are two versions found in Brand's Popular Antiquities. So there were, again, examples that were used here, but they are clearly both words in Latin, whereas the abracadabra, I believe, is Aramaic originally.
Going back to the book again, one of the things you mentioned was protection against witches.
Yes.
That seems slightly odd, because people were going to these cunning men and wise women who were effectively practicing witchcraft to ask for protection against people like them.
I see. That was the clever thing. Now, witchcraft, of course, was a crime up until fairly recently.
Yes.
But someone who was using magic to protect people against witches, that wasn't a crime. They were seen as the good guys. So there was a very kind of cleverly blurred line between the two. One man's cunning man was another man's witch. It depends really on what they were doing and how they were active. But that was by far the most common of the more mellifluous spells I came across. That was by far the most common against witches and witchcraft. There were many examples I found. Some were simple charms of things to be said. One example was just carrying particular items, which would be like a Bible or a prayer book, a piece of mistletoe, a four-leaf clover, and a rowan branch from a rowan tree. So it was simple things like that, and others were much more complex involved, and quite a few involved Latin as well. Now, I found that particularly interesting, because I didn't imagine very many people living in rural UK would have spoken much Latin beyond maybe the priest or the vicar. So they were obviously doing what they were told to do by other people, which they'd picked up from probably things like the Bible, the kind of little lines and basically made use of. I mean, one example I'm looking at right now actually was about how to spore or adversely affect a witch or deliver them to the devil. So the idea of the witch being sent to the devil. On a Sunday morning, before sunrise, you had to cut a branch of a nut tree, 1 year old, and then it gave the spell. You had to say, "I cut you, branch of this summer, in the name of him who strikes or mutilates." And having done so, you have to write on a cloth the following. Now, it's in nomine Patri Filii Spiritus Sancti, which is the name of the Father, Son, Holy Ghost, obviously in Latin. Now, they probably have heard that phrase in church many, many times.
Yes.
And so wrote down a version of it. And the spelling is a little different to the usual version you get in Latin, but that was clearly what they were trying to get across. A lot of times you come across also examples where they're using various names from the Bible, which they might not necessarily know who they were, but the names sounded quite interesting. So they things like the Holy Trinity. Punish him who has harmed me and take away the harm by your great justice. Now it is Esson Elon, Emirates Argles age, which doesn't mean anything. You stick into a good old search engine, it comes up with nothing. So it's obviously a version of spelling that they've heard and tried to write down as accurately as possible, but have probably not got it right. So it's quite a different spelling. So that was quite a common one where you found they were using versions of Latin that was kind of almost made up based on what they think they might have heard being said in the church, rather than being accurately transcribed from a Bible. Though maybe one or two might have been, but as I say, these are the ones I found the most interesting, the ones I made note of. And there were a few others that I didn't include that were to do with witchcraft and magic, because they didn't really have the direct wording. Sometimes I used to find you start reading about how this spell is supposed to work. It's really interesting, get this item and that item and do this. And then certain magic words were said. And it's like, well, what are the words? You haven't recorded the words. It's like, oh, that's a shame. So occasionally I'd jot one down that looked really interesting, only to find that the original wording was actually not present. So it's like, oh, that's no good. So I have to abandon that one. But yeah, that was probably more than anything else, that was the main topic. In fact, it's the first topic I cover in the book because there was quite a few of them. It is against witchcraft and witches. But you could sometimes wonder if perhaps the cunning man would wander into a farmstead and, notice a cow wasn't well or something like that, and then knock on the farmer's door and say, I think your cow's been cursed by a witch. If you give me a few pence, I will do the anti-witchcraft spell to clear it away from the cow, and the cow will be better. They get paid a few pence, they do their little whatever ritual dance or whatever they were going to do, then they'd sort of bugger off and never come back again. And if the cow got better, great. If it didn't, they couldn't be found anyway. So I suspect
exactly.
sometimes it wasn't quite what it appeared to be, yes.
Well, again, if they were familiar with animals, they'd know with some of them that they're either going to get better or they're going to die. You've got a 50% chance of being right on it.
Absolutely. It wouldn't surprise you if they might have found the odd little herbal plant they could give a cow that would make it ill for a few hours and then be right as rain again. Quietly feed this herb to the cow, knock on the farmer's door, do the magic, get rid of the badness in the cow, walk off, and then the cow would be fine anyway because he was certainly having an effect for a few hours. It wouldn't surprise me at all if they use their sort of knowledge of herbs to do that kind of thing. So, I mean, obviously for these people, it was a living. It was a way of surviving. They're getting paid a few pence to cast a spell or to break a spell. And if they're breaking spells, then they're on the side of the angels and the good guys. They won't be prosecuted. If you're causing badness, of course, or accused of it of being a witch, then you're in big trouble.
Yeah. Do you think some of them, I've seen the suggestion that some of the cunning men, etc., almost operated a local protection racket, sort of keep on the good side of me and I'll make sure nothing happens to you.
It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. I'm absolutely sure that would be very much the case. Build a reputation of having magical powers and you make use of that by saying, well, I'll make sure your crop do well if you pay me a few pence, and if something happens and you don't pay me, then I'm sorry, I've warned you that things could possibly happen. They're quite a mafia kind of thing of going along and say, you're doing good, your business is good, you need protecting from bad things happening. Well, if I don't pay you, then bad things will definitely happen. So it wouldn't surprise me at all, to be honest with you. I mean, obviously they're very careful because any kind of accusation of witchcraft goes to the local the police or whoever it would be, obviously a magistrate or local, and gets investigated, you're in big trouble. So they'd have to be careful how they do that, definitely. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if one or two of them were a little bit nefarious in what they were up to. But again, I think a lot of it was knowing the landscape, was knowing plants, knowing herbs, knowing animals, that you could give the appearance of having magical powers, even if you didn't at all, just by knowing how someone's going to behave. I think a lot of that was going on, certainly. I was going to say, I know for a fact that old Cunning Murrell was very much that. You too. No problem at all. And make a diaries and notes, records of things he'd heard that are being said, and then if an opportunity presented itself to feed back the information to somebody to make it appear he had magical knowledge about something, he was not above doing that, certainly. He kept records of all little tittle-tattle and tales that he heard of the local villagers and would use that information later on if it was useful to him, certainly.
Yeah. In the book, I mean, a lot of these cunning men used to also be hired to find lost or stolen goods. Does that come into your book at all?
There are a few spells that are designed to reveal things like the thief or the troublemaker. Now, again, I don't know about those because obviously if you try them and it doesn't work, it's very obvious it's not going to work. And then what do? Claim that it wasn't done properly or didn't pay them properly. So I found those a bit strange. That's taking a real chance. It's like going to see a fortune teller and then waiting around to see if the fortune teller was correct and having a go at them after if it wasn't correct. So you're taking a chance there. Now, of course, that would open up the question, well, some of them would obviously believed genuinely that this stuff worked because that's the kind of thing that's verifiable and checkable. If they identify a particular person as being a thief, that was the common one. It was like the theft and things like that. And I think one of the reasons why people would turn to these cunning men is because there wasn't really a police force. There wasn't really anyone who could turn to for justice. That if a crime was committed, the chances of anyone being able to investigate it or having the ability to, or there being anybody to investigate these things was pretty remote. So you turn to the one person who possibly might be able to help you, this person who might seem to have second sight or interesting knowledge or be able to sort of communicate with spirits to find things out, that they would be approached and contacted because they had no one else to go to effectively. And I think to take the chance that this cunning man or wise woman might be able to help is better than having no chance at all of nobody being able to help. So I think that probably did play its part, and maybe they did It could well be that they had detective skills, that they knew who to ask because they'd heard stories and whispers about someone suddenly coming into money or having a new pair of shoes or clothing they didn't have before, and someone reports having their clothing stolen off the line, that kind of thing. And they think, oh yeah, now I know Mrs. whatever was suddenly wearing that new coat that she didn't have before, and suddenly, and this person's had their coat stolen. You think, maybe they connected the two and actually worked it out, and then would appear to cast a spell that says that person is the thief, which they knew anyway. So that's certainly a possibility, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, when you were saying about Cunning Merrill spending time in pubs listening to gossip and overhearing things, that's the sort of thing where you'd pick up things like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, that's brilliant. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and your book is on sale now. It's available through Amazon. Where else is it available from?
You can get it from Three Hands Press, which is the publisher themselves, directly via them. And as I say, you can also get it via Amazon. So it's not too hard to find. As I say, it's called The Wicked Shall Decay. Stick it into Amazon search. It should come up pretty fast, and you'll be able to find it.
That's brilliant. Andy, been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much indeed. Thanks.
You're listening to the Weird Tales Radio Show with Charles Christian, part of the Paranormal UK Radio Network.
You may have caught Andrew Mercer's mention in that interview about the Essex band Depeche Mode. Here are the boys from Basildon with their 1990 hit, Enjoy the Silence. Here's Janie again, and I gather you've been urban myth busting, looking into one of the world's favourite insect pests, the cockroach.
Ah, yes, cockroaches. A glamorous assignment, thank you, Charles. Don't all be envious of me, because it's quite revolting. But anyway, I've been reading in my latest copy of Pest Control Technology magazine. That sounds a bit like one of the publications you used to write for, actually, Charles.
Yes, I recall writing for some very dull publications as well.
Anyway, as an avid reader, I've compiled my top 5 urban myths about cockroaches. So, starting at number 5, can cockroaches really run faster than people? Well, you'll be pleased to learn the answer is no. But they can run at about 3 miles an hour, and that is an average walking speed for people. And it also makes them one of the fastest insects in the world.
I think we both know a few people who walk slower than
I do
3
know.
I do are
know.
in problems.
Yes, she does her best. But
She does. So, so you can outrun a giant killer cockroach, and if you kept one as a pet, you'd be able to take it out on walkies and it'd keep up with you.
Ah, yes. Oh, you'd have a little cute harness, wouldn't you, with it?
Yes.
Anyway, number 4. Are cockroaches immortal? Or at least, can they live without their heads? We've always wondered this. Mm-hmm. The answer is a sort of yes, but only for a week or so. Their circulatory system is different, so if one did lose its head, it wouldn't bleed out. And cockroaches can breathe through holes in their body segments.
Ooh.
And even have multiple brains along their cockroachy equivalent of a spinal column to control motor functions. But without a mouth. And because it didn't have a head, it hasn't got a mouth, obviously.
Yes.
And it only has one mouth.
Yeah.
Be pleased to know, and that's located in its head. It can't eat or drink. So our headless cockroach would eventually starve to death.
Ooh.
Anyway, number 3, and here things start to get really gross. Is cockroach milk a new superfood? And weirdly, the answer is yes. Researchers have found that cockroach milk is a complete food rich in proteins, fats, sugars and peptides, which, as we know, are very good for you. And apparently cockroach milk is 4 times as nutritionally rich as cow's milk. Do you know, I can feel my gorge just coming up. Though obviously you'd need to milk a lot of cockroaches to get just enough to cover your breakfast cereal.
I think I'll stick with soya.
Yeah, well, I'm just... But the grossness doesn't even stop there. At number 2, can cockroaches swim? And the answer is yes. Apparently they can swim at a rate of 4 inches a second.
Faster
And
than
hold
me.
their... Yeah, it is. We can't really swim, can you, to be fair? At a rate of 4 inches a second and hold their breath for up to 40 minutes. Well, what this means in actuality is that they can swim up from a sewer, past the U-bends, and into your domestic plumbing, and appear in your toilet bowls, or lavatory bowls, if you're being a bit posh.
Or loo. Yes.
Or loo, yeah.
Joy, oh joy.
And now, before you lose your lunch, at number 1, in the event of a nuclear war, I know you do like your apocalyptic stories, so that's why this is at number 1. Is it true that cockroaches would be the only creatures left alive? See, this myth seems to have stemmed from a throwaway remark made after the Americans dropped atom bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the Second World War, when someone commented that cockroaches were the city's only survivors. So anyway, the American TV series Mythbusters conducted an experiment exposing cockroaches to different levels of radiation for 30 days. The lowest level was 1,000 rads, which is very, very nasty indeed. Say no more. The next was 10,000 rads, and the final level was 100,000 rads. So the results, well, all those that were exposed to the highest radiation level died, surprisingly. However, 10% of the cockroaches exposed to the massive 10,000 rads survived, and 50% of those exposed to the 1,000 rads were still alive. So this myth is actually plausible depending on the level of radiation. Yeah. And there we have it. A world where headless, radioactive cockroaches can swim up into our loos bearing gifts of nutritional milk.
The only thing I can add to that is, according to a recent report in the Sydney Morning Herald, a man in Australia's Queensland state recently blew up part of his house while trying to kill a group of cockroaches using bug spray as a flamethrower. A police spokesman said, "It looks like the guy was using pest spray in the kitchen, then a flame was lit which caused a small fire."
Well, a small fire and part of his house blew up. I think they're sort of talking it down a little bit, and it's so obviously some bloke with the pest spray and a lighter thinking, "Whoa, I wonder what would happen if I lit it and it turned into a
Flamethrower.
like you would."
Toss another cockroach on the barbie.
Yeah. No, you've got to laugh. I hope everybody was okay.
I'm
Even
sure.
the cockroaches.
Apparently everybody else in the home was fine, and he was only a little bit burnt.
Oh, I'm pleased to hear it.
We haven't had any practical magic for some time. However, talking to Andy Mercer early in the show about folk magic and charms prompted me to dig out this intriguing banishing spell. Write down on a piece of brown paper the name of something or someone you want to banish from your life. It couldn't even be some personal habit you want to be rid of. Soak the paper in 4 thieves vinegar. More about this later. Then fold the paper 3 times, so in half, then fold it again, and then fold it one final time. As you do this, say the following words: "By the power of 3, so mote it be." Then, bury the paper at the bottom of a flower pot containing some crossroads dirt. Obviously not highway crossroads dirt, you'll get run over by a truck or a car, but head out into the countryside or a park and then follow the tracks in the soil until you find where 2 paths cross. You only need a small amount of soil, as this is sympathetic magic and the soil is symbolic. Crossroads being the place where evil spirits or just plain bad vibes will become confused, as they won't know which direction to take to come back after you. Finally, plant a cactus or some similar prickly kind of plant in the pot. As you do, repeat the old Hermetic axiom, "As above, so below." Then place the pot by your front door, either outside if appropriate and warm enough, or on the inside if it's cold or you live in a flat. And that's it. But what about the 4 thieves vinegar? Well, this has a whole folklore of its own and dates back to the 17th century when the plague was rampant in France. The legend has it that in the town of Marseille, the authorities noticed that a gang of 4 thieves were regularly robbing the home of plague victims. Initially, the authorities did nothing, as they assumed the thieves would soon succumb to the plague. However, after a while it became apparent the thieves were somehow immune to the plague. The authorities therefore rounded up the 4 thieves, and in return for their freedom, they shared the secret of their immunity. It turns out the thieves were soaking themselves and their clothes in a mixture of oils, vinegar, herbs and spices. This is the recipe that was hung on the wall of a museum in Paris until it was lost sometime during the Second World War. Take 3 pints of strong white vinegar, add a handful of each of wormwood, meadowsweet, wild marjoram and sage, 50 cloves, 2 ounces of campanula roots, should that be 2 ounces of campanula roots, 2 ounces of angelic, rosemary and horehound, and 3 large measures of camphor. Place the mixture in a container for 14 days, strain and express, then bottle. The reasons why this herbal concoction may have actually worked include the fact the mixture contained natural flea repellents, since the flea is the carrier of the plague bacillus. Wormwood has properties similar to cedar and is an insect repellent, as do the aromatics such as sage, cloves and camphor, rosemary and campanula, while meadowsweet can be used to mask unpleasant smells, such as you'd get from decomposing bodies. You can still find a form of Four Thieves vinegar being sold today, including online on Amazon, as a form of natural disinfectant and insect repellent. However, another version of it is also available as a health food that you can either take a teaspoonful several times a day to help off colds and viruses, or, better still, you can pour over your food and use as a salad dressing. So there you have it, a witch's brew that can not only save you from the plague, but also flavour your food. You can't say you don't learn something on this show. Time for one final story. We started out with an item on the Ides of March, so what better than some Ides of March related music to play out on? The band is the Ides of March, who began recording in the mid-60s, had one colossal hit in 1970, broke up in 1973, then reformed in 1990, and are still playing together. Here's the Ides playing Vehicle.
Well, if you want to be a movie star, I can take you to a Hollywood. But if you want to stay just like you are, you know I think you really should. I'm your vehicle, baby. I'll take you anywhere you want to go. I'm your vehicle, woman. By now I'm sure you know that I love you, I need you, I want you, got to have your child. Great God in heaven, you know I love. Inside my car, I got pictures, candy, I'm a lovable man, and I can take you to the nearest star. I'm your vehicle, babe. I'll take you anywhere you wanna go. I'm your vehicle, woman. By now I'm sure you know that I love you, I need you, I want you, I got to have you. Great God in heaven, you know I love you, and I'm your vehicle, babe. God in heaven, you know I love you.
Janie and I will be back in 2 weeks' time. Till then, good night.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon.
Which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your fortnightly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, magic and folklore. Keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com or by email at urbanfantasist@icloud.com and on Twitter at Christian Uncut. Good night. Join us again in 2 weeks' time for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show.